Well, hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. On this program, we select core issues that affect each of us personally and very often impact our constitutional and God-given freedoms. And here we attempt to approach the issue from an identifiable biblical worldview perspective so that each of us can better understand how to think and live out a Christian witness in an often hostile and evil culture. Now, the theme for today's Part 1 program and next week in Part 2 focuses on health care. We're going to address this issue in a more practical way than the culture attempts to shape it, and more often than not, ignored, frankly, by most pastors, colleges, and even seminaries. The focus today is this: physicians and the biblical health model, more than just the body. Now, my very special guest and first time to stand in the gap is Dr. Vliet, President and CEO of Truth for Health Foundation. Creator of the Medicine and Ministry program, Dr. Vliet is an independent physician specializing in preventive and climacteric medicine. Now, I have found her understanding of medicine and physician and patient duty, the knowledge of biblical apologetics of health and healing to be not only refreshing, but complete. And an approach all people, I think, should have, but most certainly the people of God I know really should have, those who fear the Lord. Magnified during the oppressive COVID policies, but certainly not started by it, we've all witnessed a full court assault on true medicine and true science, led by corrupted government officials, pharmaceutical executives, and others. We've been subjected to a continual barrage of lies designed to counterfeit the truth and lead people through fear to embrace decisions which not only destroy the finest healthcare system in the world, but actually lead people not to better health as promised, but to sickness, disability, and even premature death. And what I just described is not only a current scenario, but it also fits perfectly with why the biblical emphasis on health and wellness is so needed. Today we're going to discuss the mission of true health care, the role of the physician, the role of the patient, and the linking of the biblical components of body, mind, and spirit, which we'll do more in the next program. But when it comes to the physician's role, it embraces the concept of healing. You know, Jesus, the great physician, emphasized the role of human physicians. Luke, a physician, records in Luke 4:23, for example, and Jesus answered them and said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." So physicians are needed when there are sick people. But since there are always sick people, there are always patients. Does life experience and scriptural principles offer a guide to the patient's role in seeking and maintaining health? It does. What is that role in health? We'll consider these questions and others today and next week in Part 2. And with that, let me welcome to the program right now for the very first time, Dr. Vliet. And Dr. Lee, we are so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Pastor Sam. It's an honor to be with you.
Well, I'm so glad for the work that you are doing, and we have a lot to get done in a short time, so let me get right into it. Let's start by defining this. You have an emphasis on, which we're talking about today, the idea of health and healing. So could you just give us a description, define what you mean in your approach as we're talking about the biblical construct of health and healing? How should we look at this in an overall perspective?
Well, ultimately, healing comes with salvation when we return home to God. That is the ultimate healing. In this world, health and healing I look at as the integration of approaching disease of the body and disease of the mind and emotions. Dis-ease means a troubled spirit, troubled mind. And then looking at the way in which dis-ease affects our spirit. I think a good example is today with all of the fear-mongering about COVID, creating a spirit of fear among people, and that is not of God. The Bible explains that is not of God. God gives us a spirit of peace. But God also gives us the potential to have peace of mind as well. And that comes from looking at the ways in which the Bible tells us to achieve that. Focus on Jesus, focus on today, cast off the anxieties about the future. And with the body, we are commanded to take care of the physical body as the temple through which we serve God and glorify Him. And the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So looking at medicine as a way of keeping our physical body healthy, helping patients to identify diseases, helping them to take steps to treat those diseases, but also steps to stay healthy by actions they can do. That's the broad picture of health and healing as I have focused on it and practiced medicine and preventive medicine my whole career.
And Dr. Vliet, great compilation and putting it together. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go away. We're going to come back in just a minute, and we'll begin to walk into now the role of the doctor, and we'll talk about the role and the duties of the patient. All of this coming up in this program in just a minute.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. Today we're talking about physicians and the biblical health model. Yes, the Bible has a health model for us. Our special guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Lee Vliet. She's a physician that specializes in this. And we want to look right now at the relationship between a biblically, a good physician and a patient. And Sam and I were, a few years ago, we were at a meeting in Harrisburg with law enforcement and the Attorney General of the nation at the time, and we were talking about opioid problems, and they had actually arrested a physician who was selling opioids, supposed medicines, like drugs on the street. It was all cash under his mattress. You find out these things. So Dr. Vliet, you hear these bad stories about doctors that don't do what's morally or ethically correct, but we know that we also trust our doctors with our lives. And what is, this relationship between doctor and patient, what is the moral and ethical duty of a true health-focused physician?
Well, the moral and ethical duty of a physician is to follow the oath of Hippocrates to serve the best interest of the individual patient to the best of our ability and judgment. And I will say clearly that that is not what is happening across America when so many physicians have signed contracts with insurance carriers and are answering to the insurance carrier or administrative people in the practice who are directing the physicians what they can and cannot do related to financial motives, not the individual interest of the patient. The duty of the physician is to show compassion, competence, and commitment. Compassion for the human being they are seeing, competence in the execution of evaluation and treatment and recommendation of appropriate treatment, outlining the benefits to the patient, potential side effects and risk, and helping the patient make an informed decision, and then commitment to the patient to help work as a partnership to carry out that duty to serve the patient.
And it's so sad. That should go without being said, but I'm glad you delineated it like that, because unfortunately, as you pointed out, we have a lot of places in our country right now where that is not how that relationship is working. So just kind of real quickly to follow up to that, then as a patient, when a patient is going to a doctor or a physician, what should the expectations be? As a patient, what should we be able to expect from the doctor that we're going to go see?
Well, I think it's important that the patient expect the doctor to be competent, to be caring and kind and compassionate. I'm shocked at the things that I hear my patients telling me about what their doctors have said to them that are actually cruel and unkind statements, condemning and judgmental in ways that are unhelpful and actually damaging. And patients should expect their doctors to be committed to them and their health concerns, not solely answering to the master of the insurance company that says, well, you have to follow these guidelines, or you can only talk about one health problem in this 10-minute office visit. You can't talk about everything that's happening. I find this offensive. I find it unethical, and I find it actually an assault on the core oath of a physician to serve the patient.
Dr. Lee, I'm going to go into the patient duty, because there are things that the patient must do if the doctor-patient relationship is going to work. But I've got to insert this question in here. It's because I know many physicians. You are a physician. You know thousands of them. But I know physicians who are at heart good physicians. They've taken the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. In some cases, they are Christian physicians who also understand the makeup of the mind and the body and the soul and the spirit as you've laid out. And I'm thinking of those who are really docs of integrity. The system right now is compromising and forcing so many good, otherwise physicians, preventing them almost from doing what they have promised in their oath to do. And limiting, as you just suggested, insurance companies saying, well, no, you can't prescribe this because we're not going to cover it. We're not going to cover the cost, or however that might be. How patients don't know these things that doctors are struggling with. And so just expand on this. For physicians who find themselves right now in a position where they are being conflicted by rules and policies and regulations preventing them from perhaps doing what they know in their heart they ought to do. What do you say to a physician like that who may be watching right now?
Well, I turn to the higher authority. I think the Bible is very clear about that. We have a choice. We have free will. Are we going to choose to follow God's commandments, or are we going to choose to follow man? Many of us, frontline physicians throughout the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic, chose to face the risk of censorship, of license attacks, change in our livelihood, because we did what was right. We chose to fight for the patients under our care. We did not hide in the corner answering to an administrator. And I would ask those physicians who have hid in the corner and said, I'm not going to treat COVID patients because a bean counter told me I couldn't, then I think those physicians need to go to God and find out what their direction in life should be if they claim to be Christian.
I think that's excellent, because the principle you just say to the higher authority is what we say. If you're in office and you're watching me and you are conflicted, you answer to God ultimately, Miss and Mr. Honorable person. So do you, pastor in the pulpit. Frankly, so do every one of us watching. So thank you for going to that principle, because that is universally applicable, and certainly as it applies to docs right now. So let's, if we could, shift to the other half. We talk about doctor-patient relationship. It's not a one-way relationship. It's like a husband and wife. There are duties, there are expectations. Let's go to the patient. How would you define and establish and identify the duties and the expectations for a patient in regard to their health? What would you say?
Well, that is a critical question because ultimately, a doctor cannot fix a patient who doesn't do his or her part. I can guide the patient into the choices and options for treatment. I can oversee it. I can prescribe it correctly. But the bottom line, the patient has to choose to take that course of treatment, to follow the guidelines, to follow the directions on the prescription. I had a COVID patient recently who waited 6 days to start the nebulized budesonide that I had prescribed at the beginning of treatment. And I'm sick. And then he got clearly worse. He had very serious lung complications, and we had to scramble hard over Thanksgiving weekend to keep him out of the hospital because he had waited to start a critical element of the treatment plan to reduce lung inflammation. Well, that's just a good example of how important it is for the patient to be truthful about their symptoms, what they're experiencing, describe them as best they can, and to be following through on the action to choose to use. And again, the Bible tells us we have to choose to act with what we know is right. And if the patient is not wanting to try that particular treatment or take that treatment, they need to communicate that to the physician. We can't help them get better if we're not given the information and if they don't carry out their actions. I can't help someone lose weight by prescribing a diet that they choose not to follow.
All right, I like the threading through of these basic biblical principles because they apply to all of life. We're just applying these to the doctor-patient relationship. But earlier, Isaac asked you to say, all right, what should a good patient who's fulfilling their duties and obligations as a good patient, what's legitimate for them to expect of the physician? Now, let me reverse that. What should the good physician, what's legitimate for that good physician to expect of, and perhaps probably train the patient to do? And it may be a lot of what you just said, but take and repackage that a little bit again, because again, as you just said, a doctor cannot achieve the goals of being a good doctor if a patient just says, I don't care what you say, I'm going to go do what I want to do. So reverse it, legitimate expectations of a good physician for a patient who is also fulfilling the duties and obligations of a good patient. What would you say?
Well, I think the physician should expect and teach the patient how to communicate effectively about what the patient is experiencing and how to give updates. For example, in my practice, I've always had the patients fill out a progress summary before their appointment. And I ask several simple questions. What's better? What's not better? What medicines are you currently taking? Because it changes between appointments. What are your supplements? And what are your questions for today? And literally, I have trained the patients that in order for me to do my best work for them, I need that information for each appointment. Some people will say, well, I don't have time to fill out the progress summary. Well, then are you going to have time to do what you need to do to take care of your health? And if you want me to do my best job, you need to take the time to find 5 minutes, 10 minutes to fill out your progress summary and tell me what's going on in your life. So I think physicians should expect that patients do that, but it's also our responsibility to teach them how to do that.
Dr. Lee, I think that's excellent. I'm going to turn to Isaac here for just a minute. We've got 1 minute before the break. You've been a pastor in the pulpit for a long time. You have young children. Isn't what we're talking about with Dr. Lee, doctor-patient, very similar to raising children or even preaching from the pulpit? If people out there don't want to listen to what's being done, it's pretty tough to make a change, right?
Yeah. Even pastoral counseling, if people won't be honest with what's really going on in their marriage, you can't take them to the passages that will help them. Or if you give them those passages and homework to do, and the same thing with preaching, if you're preaching to the people about the same sins week in and week out, but they're not willing to change what they're doing, their actions, we have to allow the Holy Spirit. And that what she's talking about as a biblical physician, we know that the Bible tells us about the good physician and us being humble enough to make that relationship with God work.
I think it's excellent. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you see the practical application. You're probably thinking through yourself and say, wow, am I doing what I need to do as a patient? Do I have a physician who's performing like what we've described? It's actually a training both ways. Ultimately, it's integrity, it's honesty, it's communication. There's just no other way around it. When we come back, we're going to wrap up this program, and then we'll set it up for part 2 next week. We'll be right back.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And as we've been looking at physicians in the biblical health model, we've been talking about how to form a biblically correct relationship between doctor and patient. I want to go to our guest, to physician Elizabeth Lee Vliet, and ask you, Dr. Vliet, some people are watching this right now and they're saying, I understand what she's talking. Maybe this is the first time they've heard a good description of what a doctor should be and their role as a patient, to realize, I'm a part of my health. And maybe there's somebody listening right now and they're wanting to ask this question and they're saying, I don't have that kind of relationship. My doctor relationship, it's not there. What are some of the hurdles that maybe are stopping us from having the kind of relationship that you just talked about that we should have with our physician?
Well, I think when patients just turn to a list of doctors on their insurance plan and they don't take the time to interview different people to see who may be a good fit, I think they end up getting someone who may not be the best match. And then when patients change doctors, like shoes in the closet, because the insurance plan changed, they are not necessarily considering their own need to have someone who has continuity with them. I've often said to patients, well, just because your insurance plan changed the physician list doesn't mean you have to change the doctor you've worked with for 10 years who knows you well. Pay a cash pay appointment visit and still see the doctor that you know and like who cares about you. But people don't think about that. They think because the insurance plan said you do this, they have to do it. And I try to get people to think about choosing options that may be better for them. Okay, so you pay, if you're taking care of yourself, maybe you only need 2 appointments in a year. That's not a lot more expensive than going out for dinners and entertainment for a couple of weekends. You have to look at it in perspective.
And Dr. Lee, I'm just going to, this is fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part 1 of our focus on doctor-patient relationship and health, body, soul, and spirit. It's more than just the body. We've kind of laid that out. We're going to talk more about it in next week. So I want you to come back because we're going to go further building out the body, soul, and the spirit. And actually, these do work together. That's the way God has made us. We'll build that out here this next week. But as I just emphasized, we leave this. A doctor-patient relationship is a relationship. It's not quite the same as a mechanic and a car. It's a relationship, integrity, communication, honesty. All of those things important, all of them right off the pages of Scripture. I encourage you to think about that. Now, thanks for watching us today. And I appreciate all of those who are communicating to us that these programs are meaning a lot in your life. Let us know about that. Partner with us this week in prayer and finances so that God can continue to bless and take this program further across the country. Until we meet again next week, stand in the gap for truth.